Crioso, and welcome to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 226, The Rise of King Coal. Coal has been called black gold for a reason. It powered the rise of industries, transformed landscapes, and shaped entire communities. In Wales, this story goes back much further than many might realize. Before the rise of the Industrial Revolution, Welsh miners were already hard at work extracting coal from some of the richest coal fields in Europe. I think this comment from Professor Robert C. Allen sums this transition up very well. In the Middle Ages, the main energy sources were firewood, charcoal, animals, and human muscle power. By 1860, 93% of the energy expended in England and Wales came from coal. The transition was slow, and much of it happened before the Industrial Revolution. Coal's share of energy generation in England and Wales rose from 10% in 1560 to 35% only 100 years later in 1660, and reached 64% in 1760, a date that is often taken to be the start of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, coal was rising in use even before the Industrial Revolution began. The history of coal in Wales stretched back for at least until the Middle Ages, as I said, and by the 13th century, coal was being dug from outcrops and shallow pits for local use. Unlike the massive mining operations we think of today, early miners were using much simpler methods. They would dig along coal seams close to the surface, often by hand, with the coal being used to heat homes or to fuel small local industries like lime kilns and smithies. But what made Wales such an ideal place for coal? This is something that we've discussed a little bit in the past. It was all down to geology. The South Welsh coal fields were a vast deposit of bituminous coal, which became especially important. This coal was found relatively close to the surface in certain areas, making it easier to extract than the deep pit mines that would come later. Even with primitive tools, you could gather most of this. Now, let's take a closer look at how early mining was done. Before the 19th century, mining technology was basic and heavily reliant on human labor. Early mines were often shallow and called bell pits, where miners would dig downward, following the coal seam before abandoning the pit once it became too dangerous or flooded or the coal was run out. Later and more structured mines, known as drift mines, were then developed. These were horizontal tunnels that followed coal seams into the sides of hills, requiring fewer resources than deeper vertical shafts. It wasn't until the late 18th century that deeper mines began to appear, supported by the development of water pumps to remove flooding and ventilation systems to help circulate air, which was critical, obviously, as you got farther down, and fresh air was something that didn't exist down there. Even so, these innovations didn't make work any less perilous. Deadly gases, known as fire damps, were a constant threat, causing explosions when ignited by a single spark from a miner's lamp. The invention of the Davy lamp in the early 19th century helped mitigate this danger, but the early years of mining were marked by frequent accidents and fatalities. Before the mighty coal boom of the late Victorian era, Wales was already a region of industrial change. The early 19th century saw the foundations of what would become the country's most important industry, coal mining. In the 1840s, coal fields of South Wales were just beginning to expand, and with this expansion came hardship, danger, and a growing working-class consciousness. In the 1840s in Wales, there was a time of course, immense change. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, the demand for coal was skyrocketing, and while iron had already established itself in places like Merthyr, coal was quickly becoming the backbone of industrial growth both in Wales and across Britain. But for those who worked in the mines, the reality was far from the wealth and progress enjoyed by industrialists and mine owners. The daily grind of a coal miner in the 1840s was a relentless battle against both the dangers underground and the economic pressures on the surface. Let's look at a typical day of a miner in 1840s Wales. Miners, or colliers as they were often called, would start work before dawn, often waking in small, cramped cottages with large families. After a meager breakfast, they would make their way to the mine. Descending in the dark, damp, and coal tunnels, men and boys would begin their 12 to 16-hour shifts, swinging pickaxes at the coalface. Now, key to all of this is what I did mention boys. And it was the case that boys did work in the mines. Boys as young as 5 were sent underground, often tasked with crawling through narrow tunnels to haul coal carts, a practice known as trapping. These children endured some of the harshest conditions imaginable. But with rapid expansion came social tensions. As more workers were drawn into the mines, the harsh conditions and low wages sparked early labor unrest. One of the first major events, of course, we've mentioned many times during the last few episodes, is the Merthyr Rising of 1831. This was a violent workers' protest over unemployment, high prices, and poor working conditions, not just in the coal mines, but in the ironworks and other industries as well. Though the full force of organized labor movements wouldn't appear until later in the century, these early struggles were seeds of what would become the powerful force of Welsh history. Miners would eventually play leading roles in shaping labor rights, not just in Wales, but across Britain. These conditions sparked the interests of reformers and especially led to the 1842 Mines Act, which prohibited women and children under the age of 10 from working underground. While this was a step forward, it was not really far enough to ease the hardship faced by mining families, and it only works as far as it's applied. If people ignore these requirements, then it doesn't matter whether there's law if there's no enforcement. And the act did little to improve the conditions for men or even for children who continued to work above ground or still in many cases in dangerous roles underground. This period was, of course, when the coal industry was expanding rapidly, laying the foundations for its dominance in the later 19th century in Wales. But with the growth came huge demands for labor, and for many, coal mining was the only available job. Families from rural areas migrated to the coal fields in search of work, creating rapidly expanding industrial communities around Merthyr, Rhondda, and Swansea. These communities grew fast, but life was hard. Homes were often hastily built, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread easily because of this combination of small, poorly built houses, and usually cramped places, if we're honest. Life expectancy for these people was generally short. And then there were the dangers in the mines themselves. The colliery accidents were tragically common throughout this period. Without modern safety equipment, miners faced deadly and dangerous threats daily, from fire damp to highly explosive gas and roof collapse. A single spark could trigger a deadly explosion, wiping out dozens of lives in an instant. One of the worst tragedies of this period was the Nantyglo colliery explosion of 1839, where 26 men and boys lost their lives. Unfortunately, this kind of disaster was not an isolated event, as I just mentioned. Such accidents became a grim part of life in the mining communities, and as the industry expanded, so too did the number of fatalities. We're going to now discuss a couple of other examples that happened in the late 1840s and 50s, and as kind of just the tip of the iceberg of what was going on and why these would happen. On the 14th of February, 1844, 58 men and women and boys were working in garden pit at land shipping on the eastern branch of the Clethau River when disaster struck. Pit workings extended out under the river where the water suddenly burst through the walls of the mine and 40 miners were overwhelmed and drowned before they were able to have time to escape. There had been mining in the area since the Middle Ages, but they had recently restarted in earnest around 1788 after being shut down for a while. However, this was a low-key and seasonal affair as these mines were being worked by agricultural laborers in the quiet times of year, obviously making a bit of money to go along with their raising of crops. Then, in the 1800s, Sir Hugh Owen installed the first steam engine in the Pembrokeshire coal fields at his mine in land shipping. and the industry transformed itself into an altogether different beast. Soon, over 10,000 tons of coal and coal were being produced each year. It was an industrial site and no longer a simple seasonal mine. By 1844, Colonel John Owen had succeeded to the estate and quickly developed the infrastructure needed for such an enterprise of this industrial nature. In particular, he built a quay at land shipping from which most of the coal was shipped to a wide variety of destinations. Garden Pit, like several of the mines around Clethau, suffered badly from waterlogging, but even so, the shaft was still some 67 yards deep. Most of the workings ran out for as much as a quarter mile beneath the river, and at points there was just a difference of 3 feet between the river waters and the actual mine itself. The level where the disaster occurred had not been worked for 2 or 3 years, as miners had reported a significant leak in the roof of that particular tunnel. However, in February 1844, it was considered safe to again open these workings, and on the afternoon of the 14th, 58 miners were employed in digging for coal and transporting the product back to the pit shaft from that specific location. The first inklings that something was wrong came when, just before 4 p.m., a powerful current of air suddenly shot up from the shaft. It was powerful enough to force the hands and arms of men working on the surface into the air. When spectators noticed a series of violent eddies, almost like whirlpools in the water close to the shore, the next thing they realized and knew, several miners appeared at the bottom of the shaft screaming for assistance. 4 men and 14 boys were quickly hoisted up the shaft in the buckets that normally carried the coal. Swirling water pulled at their boot tops as, behind them, the pit filled at a rate of 7 fathoms in a minute. Nobody else managed to get out, and 40 miners were drowned or crushed by the fall of rock and mud that accompanied the flooding. One miner gave an account of his escape, and this was paraphrased in the local press. Quote, "He was overtaken by the water, which almost prevented his progress, dashing him several times against the side of the pit. When he got into the light, he rushed past another man who was about to get into the bucket and was hauled to safety. The water followed him so closely that the next and last man only were saved by climbing up the side of the pit until the bucket, which had descended to others, was raised and reached him. The water had broken into the garden pit relatively close to the shore, cutting off 33 miners working at the far end of the pit. The horror of such a death can only be imagined. The other 7 casualties, men and women and children working near the shore, had been overtaken by the deluge before they could get out. Dr. Robert Llewellyn Davies, during a rededication of the site in 2019, said, quote, "What we now know is that there were at least 4 boys under the age of 10 and 3 were just 10 years old that were killed. Sir John Owen and his colliery manager, James Cole, which would have known under the Coal Mining Act of 1842 that it was illegal for children under the age of 10 to work below ground, obviously allowed this to happen. The cause of the disaster was put down to the pressure of the water, particularly as it had not previously been worked at high tide, so there was no understanding of what could happen. But in those days, there was no mining inspector to check on the aspects of safety. And some reports say that the miners had already left the pit once that day because they were concerned about their safety, only to be sent down to finish their shift. These disasters weren't just the tip of the iceberg for mine safety issues. Management's desire for financial gain and meeting the high demand of coal in industries and eventually homes meant that safety regulations were often skirted or outright broken in the quest for more of king coal. This will be a subject in Wales from this period until almost when most of the mines are shut down in the 1980s. And in the process, many will be killed, injured, and left with the mental anguish and scars that were likely never healed due to the loss of loved ones or watching friends and neighbors go missing or be killed in these disasters. Another example from the period happened at the Chimera Colliery. George Insull and his son James Harvey Insull purchased the Chimera Colliery in 1844. In 1847, they sank number 1 pit, which after 1853 would become known as Kimmery Old Pit. After his father died in 1851, James Insull took full control of the business. Between 1852 and 1855, Her Majesty's Inspector of Mines, Herbert Francis Mackworth, inspected the colliery twice and sent letters to Insull recommending safety improvements, in particular to the mine's underground ventilation system and the use of safety lamps underground, something which had existed and were key in helping prevent explosions. The fact that there was nothing more than a few recommendations showed how weak the enforcement was in the period, and the reality of it was there was little that could be done with some of the safety measures to make sure they actually were put in place. In 1854, the mine manager, Jabez Thomas, dismissed 2 experienced firemen and appointed 2 others from outside the colliery who did not necessarily have the experience working in that particular mine. The workmen complained to Insull as they had no confidence in these replacements. Firemen were key. It was their job to go below and ensure that there was no issues with ventilation, with the possibility of methane buildup or something along that line, which could cause explosions, obviously. All of these things were key, and that was part of the job. And unfortunately, if you don't have the experience in working in that mine, you may not understand fully what the problems are. Insull, instead of listening to his men, decided that they needed to bend to his authority, and he stood firm. This would then lead to a 22-week miners' strike against the working conditions. Financial loss and threat of legal action eventually compelled the men to return to work under these new firemen. The pressure on Insull to get his mine working was twofold. One, if he failed, it could go under. But as well, demand right now for coal was sky high, so profits were as well. The Crimean War of 1856 had created additional demand for coal, and in 1855, Insull intensified his mining operations at the old pit, doubling the number of miners and increasing the mine area by over a third. Safety issues and stress to get as much as possible from out of the mine likely created the situation that would be set in motion and the disaster that was to come. On Tuesday, July 15th, 1856, 160 men and boys descended into the old pit mine shaft to commence their 6 a.m. shift. As they made their way to the workplace underground, there was an explosion of gas near the mine entrance, which trapped the miners already deeper in the mine. It was 3 hours before rescuers could even reach the site, and they found that many of the miners had grouped together as they ran out of air and died. By that evening, 112 bodies had been recovered. Another was brought up the next day, and a severely burnt miner died the following day. In his report to the Secretary of State for the year of 1856, Mines Inspector Mackworth described the disaster as the most lamentable and destructive explosion which has ever occurred at any colliery either in this country or abroad. An inquest was then called, as you can imagine, and the evidence indicated that the explosion resulted from defective mine ventilation, obviously reported earlier, and the use of naked flame underground, something which could not have happened had they actually been using proper lamps such as the Davy lamp, which all had existed well before this. Despite warnings being sent to the mine owner by Mackworth, he told the inquest that, quote, the explosion arose from the persons in charge of the pit neglecting the commonest precautions for the safety of the men and the safe working of the colliery, end quote. Among the 114 victims, 34 were boys under the age of 16, and another 15 were under the age of 12. Insull, the mine owner, walked free from the inquest after claiming he, quote, took no part in management, end quote, of the mine. The mine manager, Jabez Thomas, and the mine officials, Roland Rowlands, Morgan Rowlands, Dave Jones, and William Thomas, were charged with manslaughter for negligence causing the death of 114 men. But amid these hardships and danger that the miners of Wales began to find themselves in, they also found their collective voice. The 1840s saw the first stirrings of what would become powerful labor movements. As conditions worsened, miners started to organize. The seeds for unionism were sown in the coal fields as workers realized that only by standing together could they fight for better wages, safer conditions, and more respect of them and their job. Their early unity would grow into something much larger in the decades to come, and eventually would lead to famous strikes and the rise of powerful labor leaders in Wales. But in the 1840s, it was just the very early beginning. So, what was the legacy of coal mining and this industry in the 1840s? It was an era of hardship and danger, but also of resilience. The people who worked in these early mines, men and women and children, laid the foundation for the Welsh coal industry, which would come to dominate the global energy market by the end of the 19th century, which would, of course, develop into the power structure that we would come to know, that coal would become a great driving force of the desire for humanity to industrialize and to grow their industries. Even today, coal is still used to power various factories across the world. And even though we have a different understanding of the way coal works and the way we should and shouldn't be using it, there is still this desire to use what is a very easy, in quotes, source of cheap power. It is still very plentiful across the world, unlike some of the other sources that we do use and do need. And so there is still this desire to go into the mines and collect coal and continue to spew the carbon it has soaked within it into the atmosphere. And regardless of what you think about all that, I think it's important to understand that it was a driving force in helping to modernize both society outside of Wales, but also to modernize society in Wales. A lot of the culture we understand today, a lot of the driving forces of what would later become Welsh nationalism come out of the coal mines. They drive a lot of this. And so for us in this area, so for us in this era, it is important to understand just how significant it is and how important it is to Wales as a nation. The music and poetry that we have, sometimes some of the songs that we sing even today still have and harken back to mining and the hardships that were faced by it and the shutting down of said mines and how that also affected Wales, because even as they were shut down, there was a struggle against this because of the cost it had to people's economic well-being. So we have to understand all that and put it into context. And we will again and again and again go back to the coal mines because of how significant they are to Welsh history and how much comes out of them. We've just barely touched the surface of the labor movement that will come out of them and how influential it was in driving change in the mines that would make them, to a degree, safer. It would not, however, avoid the problems that we'll see later with management taking risks that they shouldn't, with overwork, with badly plotted and not very safe ideals being practiced. And there are still many larger and more horrible disasters to come because of it. But yet out of it grows a great deal of our modern understanding of Welsh culture and a lot of the pride that people feel because they worked in those mines, because of how significant they were in their lives. And it touches pretty much every Welsh family from those early 1800s until at least the 1980s in some form or fashion. And I think that's something to remember. Pretty much everybody in their family tree has somebody who worked in the mines. And that's something to keep in mind. And of course, with everybody working in the mines, there were some that lost their lives in the mines. And that too did affect family members, both in their time and in the future. So with all that said and done, thank you everybody for listening and viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or on Twitter, commonly now known as X, at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you would like to help out the podcast through your financial support, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everybody. Have yourselves a great day. We'll see you next week for more Ancient Wales. Until then, take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.